Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to discuss part 2 of the overview tutorial for the fall asymmetrical front wrap vest. So this is a very cozy vest I designed for the fall in a nice textured sort of stripe effect with a rib look. And we could put on 4 or 5 buttons in part 1, depending again what you liked and what your preference was. And we covered how to make the vest using a size medium example and what your options were as you created the 2 front panels, the back panels, and then assembled that together. So in this part 2 video, I'm going to go over what are all your finishing options as you think about exactly how you would like to finish off your version of the vest. So how can you customize this and make it uniquely yours? Now, as always, for all of the projects I post a link to my Ravelry project page. And that's because I forget lots of details, and that is where I'm going to post photos and notes or links or anything that I might want to go back and reference as I create a version of this vest for someone else. So that and my website are great resources if you just want to look up a bit more information. Now that's also where I will always post all of my patterns. Now I have free and paid patterns, but these 3 patterns are a paid series of patterns that are raising funds for a cancer charity. And so again, we have the fall cozy wrap version that I'm going to highlight today, but there are also videos and tutorials on the summer version, which is a polo neck kind of front single-breasted vest, or my favorite vest of all time, which goes into my suitcase and goes everywhere with me, which is the versatile travel vest. Now, because these have very different yarns from a weight 1 to today's weight 4 yarn, and the constructions were just slightly different because of some of the variations with the single-breasted, double-breasted, or collars, I did make them 3 separate patterns. But again, I'm going to be posting a download where you can actually purchase all 3 at once. So let's start talking about the fall vest and how we're going to add a shawl collar. Now I decided to do the shawl collars in a half double crochet. I like the height and I like the look of the stitch, but again, you can change your options if you prefer other stitches to finish off your collars. So depending on your yarn, if you're using a substitute, you just might want to take a minute and look at what your half double crochet gauge is. So I post mine on the website and on the pattern, and again, you can use that as a comparison if you do have to make any adjustments. Now, we finished off the vest in the front panels with just a row of single crochet, and so that's really helpful now that we're going to be counting stitches and adding a rolled collar on. Across the back of the piece, however, we have this stitch pattern repeat that we did, which was 1 row of single crochet followed by a row of alternating slip stitch and half double crochet. So just a note that as you go across the back of the neckline to pick up those stitches to create the shawl collar, you just want to make sure that you're picking up both of those rows and the repeats, because it's a little bit trickier than if you were just picking up the straight single crochet. If you're a beginner, you can absolutely add a row of single crochet as a foundation row, but if you just take your time and work your way across, you'll find it pretty easy to add in your first row of half double crochet to begin the collar. So let's talk a little bit about short row collars, because this is how we're going to work the shawl collar. And I'm going to go through a couple of considerations before you begin, because you may prefer a very narrow shawl collar, you may prefer a short versus very long shawl collar. So we'll talk about what are all these choices and how do you alter what I did as the pattern guide if you want to make some changes to, again, just make this your perfect version of the vest. So the short row collar that we're doing today is basically adding a rolled collar. And you're going to decide on your preference for the length of the kind of shawl element and the width of the shawl element. Now, most short rows start with short rows across the back of the neck because you do want some height there for your collar to roll over and lay nicely. But really where we're going to vary the short rows and the shawl elements is how wide of an opening do you want and how much width of the shawl do you want to carry down the front. So again, as we do the half double crochet, I'm using 3 stitches per inch, and the yarn has a pretty soft kind of loft to it, making the roll kind of lovely. If you're using a substitute yarn that is far denser, gives you a bit more of a maybe a corset kind of finish, a much more tailored finish to this, you'll have to take that into consideration because it will adjust sort of the fit and the style of the collar as you go along. But I like a collar that is a bit wider, and I'm designing the pattern to be a bit more open because the length, again, that you remember that we made for the neckline could vary from 0 to 13 inches. But I'm demonstrating for the medium a 13-inch depth that again shortened when we did the short rows and shortens even further as we add the shawl trim elements, because I wanted to wear it not only with sort of a t-shirt, but also if you wore a more formal collared shirt underneath. So this opening had to be kind of wide enough that if you put a collared shirt underneath, it sort of sat nicely. So again, I'm looking for the most versatility in the design. It does not mean, though, that you cannot absolutely adjust it for whatever your personal preference is. So we can go anywhere from very close to the neck to wider and open to accommodate layering of different garments underneath. It's just whatever you think is going to work for you. So again, when we did the neckline at the part 1 series, I kind of highlighted it could be anywhere from 10 to 13 inches and really measure for your own individual preference. What are you most comfortable with? And so we're going to work with the rest of the tutorial today on whatever depth you liked and preferred. What we now need to figure out, though, is do you want a very high shawl collar that is, close up to your neck? Do you want a very wide shawl collar where the actual fold is quite dramatic and goes all the way to the tip, to the point? If we did that, it would look gorgeous. It might fold over and cover up some of your buttons, so that is an absolutely beautiful look that you could absolutely go for if it's something that interests you. It just might factor in where exactly you place the buttons if you don't want those peeking out from underneath. So we're going to go all over the place, but I'm starting with the 13-inch neck that I demonstrated. And here's part way through where we're going to place some markers to help us decide how wide and how far do we want the shawl collar to go. Now I made our shawl collar pretty wide. It's about 5 inches. Again, to the crossover point, I wanted that nice sort of width and the roll effect. I could have carried that all the way again on the front panel farther down. I wouldn't recommend putting it on the under panel because you don't want a lot of bulk there as that folds over. But you could absolutely, again, make a more dramatic front panel with a really wide shawl collar that stays wider farther down along the front. Again, if you like the rolled effect but you don't want that sort of drama, you could end the shawl collar here higher than what I show here. I'm showing it sort of at the crossover point where we had our green marker, but you could make it even higher than this, or you could make it longer and more narrow. So the nice part about doing this short row technique is you have complete control to make design fit kind of accommodations as you go to give you the exact look for your specific body type. So again, someone with wide hips, someone with a larger bust may want to shift where they've got the collar placed. And so we'll walk through exactly how do we look at all of the options, guide you through how to make short rows and end up with a collar that you're going to love. So let's talk about the short row technique to show you if you want a short, tight versus wide open, how are you going to play around to get the changes that you would like? Well, for beginners, I find it really helpful to illustrate and put some markers into place. So again, on the vest that I'm illustrating for the size medium, I'm going to start my shawl collar at the tip. So on the overlapping panel, which is the left side as you're looking at it, the right side as you're wearing it, I'm going to start my half double crochet at that bottom orange marker. I'm going to work up all the way around the neckline, but I'm going to end most of my shawl collar at the green marker above the buttons, because that's the piece that goes underneath, and I don't want a lot of extra length to the shawl collar or the bulk going underneath, and then your vest doesn't lay nice and flat. So that's the version that I'm going to illustrate, but I'll explain what the technique is so you can change it if you'd like to. Now, short rows exist because we created this decrease and increase around our neck on the back panel. And the short rows start by filling that gap in to start off your collar so that you can create a nice kind of high rolled collar behind your neck to keep your neck nice and cozy. So the short row component is going to start with however many stitches you have, depending on the width of your back panel and the depth of your neckline opening, to fill in that gap first, and then we'll explain what the variability is that affects the rest of how your collar works. So I'm going to say for a small, you could have, 20 stitches, maybe 26 stitches, and then working up to the extra large sizes. But let's use, I think I had 26 stitches on my medium, but let's use 20 just because it's easier math. So if you're filling in that back panel that just goes across the back of your neckline, your first row would be 20 stitches, but you do have a couple of rows that you need to fill in because we did a couple of rows of decreases. So each time you do a row of short rows, you stagger the end so that you can actually, stretch out the collar. So again, we could do 20 stitches for however many rows we're filling in this space, and then I'm going to start doing my increases to stretch out my collar and make a staggered kind of increase to get the bulk. So let's start with 3, which is what I did for the vest. So I'm doing a few rows where I'm adding 3 stitches as I go each time I finish that short row. So if you had, for example, 9 short rows, once you filled in the back collar space, that is going to add 27 to 36 stitches down, across your shoulder and down the front. So if you counted 36 stitches from the, end of your back dip where your shoulder comes in, so where you initially did that decrease or the increase, and put a marker on your front panel, you will get a sense of where your shawl collar is going to continue or stop. So again, if we did not do 3 or 4 stitches to get us this many stitches, we only did 2, our shawl collar is going to stop much higher up closer to our neck. A 36-inch stitch, if we did 4 stitches on either side as we finish the short rows, is going to take you quite a bit farther down the front of your vest. So the more stitches you add to stagger at the end of each short row is going to make your collar flare outwards and make a wider, longer rolling shawl collar with a lot of the growth at the front, not just filling in behind your neck. So again, the simple kind of construction of short rows is the fewer stitches you add as you stagger each of those short rows, the higher, tighter your collar is going to be. The more stitches you add is going to create a wider rolling shawl collar with a lot of the growth at the front edge. So this is where you can easily, again, make a skinnier front panel if you want a very narrow shawl collar, or make a much bigger, wider shawl collar than even I did. So again, we do each kind of pass across that back of the neckline, filling in the gaps, and then we start adding 3 or 4 stitches on either end. And I started with a few rows of 3 and then increased to 4 to just get me down far enough to what I liked. So it can be really helpful as you're trying to visualize this, if you're a beginner and not done it before, to use some markers and do some stitch counts to really kind of figure out exactly where do you want your shawl collar width to start and stop. So again, we've got our back neckline, which is the gap that we're filling in, and that's our first short row, so it might be 20 stitches. And then again, if you're going to count 36 stitches beyond that to add 4 at either end, you count 36 stitches along the front and put a marker where that 36 stitch count would be. So again, it could be exactly where your green markers are, or 1 or 2 different, or I could do 2 increases and make it much higher. So I did 13 inches again as my V-neck depth, so that's where I have my green markers. You have your decision around where do you want to start and stop your collar. So do you want it to go all the way to the tip or not? And then you can put a third set of markers just to keep track if you're a beginner. Count those stitches out that you're going to extend on your short rows and see how far down the front your shawl collar is going to go. And again, the more it goes towards the front, the wider that is, and you control the width by the number of short rows that you're going to do. So you can make it very wide, you can make it the 5 inches approximately that I did, or you can make it much narrower. You could take it down to, for example, 3 inches. So it's whatever visually you like. And again, everybody's going to be different, so we can just match your preference. So now you can see where I have my starting orange point at the tip, and I have where my shawl collar is going to end, and it's very close to that 13-inch crossover that I had marked originally when we did the neckline. So we're going to work our way from the tip all the way up. I'm going to fill in my short rows across the back, and you're going to fill in that gap on the back panel. You're then going to do however many short rows you decide. And again, you can kind of stop, pause, look at it. Is it wide enough? Is it not? Do I like it? Do I not like it? Finish the amount of short rows that you like for your preferred width and depth of how wide and how far down is that shawl collar going to roll. And then consider this, that at the end, you're still going to want to finish off with your final trim options. So that could be doing half double crochet, again, if you're going right to the tip to make that blend in and look deliberate that you took the shawl collar all the way down. Or you could just be adding some slip stitch trim depending on what your options were. So again, I did half double crochet right from that orange tip all the way around to finish off the collar on the shorter underlapping panel at where the 13-inch marker was, so that I didn't get too much going underneath. So that was my decision. But again, I could have made a much wider shawl collar on the overlapping panel and gone quite wide all the way down to the tip. So start making your short rows. Again, you're filling in the back piece. So I started half double crochet at the tip to get a nice finish, worked my way up. When I got to the back, I started doing short rows to fill in, and you can see that I'm extending them as you go, 3 inches initially, and then I went to 4 inches. Again, you can measure to your comfort level, and you're just going to continue adding these short rows until you get enough of a rolled effect and enough of a width that you like it. Again, very easy to frog it out. If you don't, if you want to create again a higher version, you're not liking how far down it's coming, or you like less length on the front, you can easily change the number of short rows which is what's going to change the visual finish of your shawl collar. So keep going around until you get the short row width that you'd like, and then you can finish it off with a few rows of trim to just make it really blend in perfectly, because again, each of those short rows has a staggered piece to it, and at the end you want to make sure your final staggered is finished nicely and blending into the rest of your finish. So let's talk about all of our trim options and ideas, and we'll start with the buttons, because we touched upon how you think about your shawl collar may impact what you choose as far as your buttons. Now in part 1, I showed how to adjust for size preference by increasing or decreasing the number that you chain and skip. And the tip, if you're new to buttonholes, is always to make the opening smaller than your button, because your yarn will stretch. Now I have done vertical, very beginner friendly holes. You can, if you have more talent and time, make horizontal holes. They are shown to hold up a lot if it's got a lot of wear and tear. The other thing though is thinking about the color and contrast and the number. So I did go for buttons initially that are the same kind of tone as the vest, and they really do blend in, and I think I might in the future swap out some buttons if I find some beautiful ones that offer a bit more drama, which is what I kind of initially thought of as I designed this vest. So a tip would be to really do think about contrasting perhaps buttons to give you the wow factor and really highlight that this is a key element of the design. And again, I'm on the hunt for some really visually interesting ones, so let me know if you've got some recommendations for where to buy beautiful buttons. And again, I went with a 1 inch on the vest as an example of size, just so you look at the visuals and get that. Now, I did have one button that was a bit of a challenge, and I ended up going from 4 in part 1 to opting to add a 5th button just because I had it and I just like the button look. But absolutely go with 3 if you have larger hips. It's up to you, and it really is just your personal preference. So let's talk about that 5th button or the 4th button on the first video, because it is on the return down lower than the tip. And if you are sitting a lot, this button is the one that has been tricky for people because the button was popping out. And the fixed tip we have for that is to slip stitch your buttonholes to reinforce it and just give a bit more strength to that lower button, because if it's getting a lot of action, it will just keep that button from sliding around in the hole. I had another tester who preferred to leave that button off, and again made it perfect sense. It looks spectacular. So again, if you do have larger hips or you're getting a lot of wear and that button is struggling, you can test it or decide to leave it in or leave it out. I quite like the more corseted fit look to the vest without it being super tight. So for me, that button, once I slip stitched it, actually was, you know, a bit of a fix. It popped the button out and kept it in place. Now again, for the beginner friendly trim options that I'm showing in illustrating, I did slip stitch because it is the easiest. So I slip stitch around the armholes, and I slip stitched around everything. So when I did the hem, I kept going all the way around the collar as well for just 1 row of slip stitch to just pull it all together. Now, when I'm doing 2 rows of slip stitches around the arms, or you might want to do that across the back hem as I did, I do the 2nd row in back loop only, just because I like the finish. So if you want a more sort of interesting or varied hem option, absolutely change up your slip stitch or, you know, trim stitch options. The one I have posted in the pattern uses a vertical bar. I think it's beautiful with 2 or 3 rows of a kind of finished off look, And it really is a nice border stitch because it stays flat. So a very similar look to a slip stitch, but if you are doing a little bit of a wider border, that is a great option as well. It lies beautifully flat, and once you block it, looks spectacular. So you can do that as a border stitch. If you really do like the half double crochet that you're carrying on with your collar, and again, maybe doing a more dramatic collar, you could absolutely do half double crochet as your finishing edge as well, all the way around. So lots of options, again, beyond just even color changes and looking at that. On the versatile vest, I did slip stitch as well to keep it pretty straightforward, but I did a final row in the blue just to add, again, a touch of piping to that finished look. So feel free to play around with your trim options as you finish off the vest. Now there are some tips because, as I said, the buttons can be a bit of a struggle if you have larger hips, and changing that placement might work better for your figure. I had someone who was an hourglass that loved that change. The other change, and this also came from an extra large, was how do I get the point to stay, solid as a more tailored looking point when I'm sitting all day, and that sort of longer flap wouldn't look great at the end of the day. I do this trick a lot, especially when I want to reinforce a shoulder on a cardigan, which is to add some slip stitch to the inside of the point to reinforce the shape you want to keep. So on a medium or a large vest, you might just want to add one row of slip stitching. On the extra large, we tested out adding a shaped slip stitch to the inside of that point. And it really did, because they also used a bit of a softer, I would say, yarn, hold the shape of the point, and it looked crisp. So again, your yarn choice, if you choose a denser yarn, will give you much more of that sort of corset, kind of very tailored, structured look, versus a loftier, softer yarn. You might want to try that trick with some additional stitching on the inside. Again, a simple line of slip stitch to reinforce the point and keep it from curling if you're sitting all day. So any number of button choices, a whole bunch of trim option choices, lots of, again, variability, and we'd love to see how they look when they're done. Thanks as always for your support.